Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the Employment and Recruitment Federation's Pension Auto-Enrolment webinar. And what does this mean for you? So today we're delighted to have two speakers for us. To start us off, we're going to have Ben Grehan, Senior Financial Advisor with almost 10 years experience in financial services, working for various life companies. But over the last 3 years, Ben has been part of Chapter Financial, and he has been dealing directly with individuals on a personal and corporate level, helping clients successfully reach their financial goals. He is a certified financial advisor, a retirement planning advisor, and he is now working towards achieving this prestigious certified financial planner accreditation. So Ben is going to bring us through the nuts and bolts of what this is going to mean and how it's going to operate. And then after Ben, we're going to delighted to have with us today Managing Partner of Stratus Consulting and also Policy Advisor to the Employment and Recruitment Federation, our friend Brendan McGinty, who's going to talk through the practicalities of what this is going to mean, the likelihood of when it's going to happen. And I look forward to learning about how we're going to employ this and literally how soon it is in our future. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Ben Grehan. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, I'm just trying to see if I can work my way through these slides here. Where's the button here? No, I think that worked there. So I suppose first off, we'll probably just have a look at to see exactly where this auto-enrollment retirement savings bill is at. Now, first off, I'd probably like to say if Slow and Steady wins the race, I suppose the setup of the statewide auto-enrollment scheme in Ireland would certainly be the undisputed champion. It has been in the government's pipeline since 2006, so it's almost 20 years that they've been kind of considering implementing something like this. And only last month then Minister Humphreys published the retirement savings bill, and the enactment of the legislation is due in Q2. So that is when we'll have a final draft of exactly what we are to expect. So I suppose a lot of you might have questions. Why are they planning on enrolling or kind of introducing something like this? We're one of the only OECD countries without an auto-enrolment or mandatory pension scheme. They want less reliance on the state pension. And it's estimated that approximately there's 800,000 individuals without a private pension who are going to be solely reliant on this state pension. I suppose to put that into context, if someone who was earning a salary of 50,000 was to retire tomorrow and be solely reliant on the state pension, it's a drop of 70% of their income, which is huge. So it's really there to kind of help bridge that gap between post-retirement and pre-retirement into retirement. So to help maintain good living standards in retirement, and also increase the well-being and financial security and independence of older people. Look, we're all living longer, which is great, but it just means you're going to have more need for income in retirement. So the system itself is to be set up, hopefully, from January 2025 next year, ready for first contributions. And just go on to the next slide here. There, yeah. So I suppose an overview. It's a retirement savings system for employees. Was planned to be introduced in January of this year. It's been pushed back again to January 2025. So if you look at then who's it going to affect, or what employees is it really going to affect? So anyone who does not have or isn't currently contributing into a pension scheme, earning more than 20,000 a year and aged between 23 and 60 is going to be automatically enrolled in this auto-enrollment pension scheme. Now, they have advised that anyone outside that threshold can voluntarily enroll if they want to. So if you're not currently contributing to a pension scheme, earning less than 20,000, or aged outside the 23 to 60 age bracket. So I suppose what it means is for the first time, employers will be required to make pension contributions for employees. And employees includes employees on probation, casual or part-time. So it's really from day one that when they join a company, if they're within that threshold of earning more than 20,000 and age between 23 and 60, they are going to be automatically enrolled into this system. And they have excluded self-employed and then anyone who is already contributing into a company pension scheme. Let me try going to the next slide again. So the contribution levels, these are going to be calculated on employees' gross earnings up to 80,000 per year. Now the employee contributions, they're not relieved for tax or USC or PRSI like the existing traditional pensions that are currently in place. It's going to be done very similar to the old SSIA or the state savings scheme that was set up a couple of years ago on a top-up basis. So for every €3 paid by the employee, the state will top up by €1. So it's a 33% top up, and it's equivalent to a 25% tax relief. So if you were to compare that, I suppose, to anyone who is currently contributing into a traditional pension scheme at the marginal rate, they'd be getting 40% tax relief, and on the lower rate it would be 20%. So it's kind of in the middle there, but definitely anyone who's earning higher than 42,000 or being taxed at the marginal rate is going to be better off in a traditional pension scheme that will be available. So there's no option to additionally fund into the auto-enrolment scheme. They have said down the line they may look at introducing something like that. So currently there isn't any option to do what's called AVCs, or additional voluntary contributions. It's going to be phased in over a 10-year period. From year one, it's going to be 1.5% employee matched by the employer and a top up of 0.5% by the government, which gives a total of 3.5%. So that's going to gradually work its way up over a 10-year period to 6%, 6% employee, 6% employer, 2% government top up, which will give a total of 14% applied into a pension for the employees. So who's going to look after this auto-enrolment scheme? There's an independent body being set up known as, or it's going to be called the National Automatic Enrolment Retirement Savings Authority, for AE for short, or Auto-Enrolment Authority. They're going to be responsible for the overall administration of this pension scheme. They're going to collect the contributions and distribute them for investment. They'll allocate the investment returns to the employee accounts, and they'll also operate the online portal where it's going to show the account balance, the option to do any fund switches, and also the option to opt out should an employee request to do that. They'll be responsible for compliance of the scheme, and they're also going to guide the evolution of the auto-enrolment scheme over the next decades. So I've just put in a sample illustration here just to show you, I suppose, the level of contributions, or what an employee might expect if they were contributing into this auto-enrolment scheme. So we look at Jack, age 25. He's going to be contributing up to the state pension age of 66. So it's 41 years. He is earning 25,000 per annum, and we based it off the max. So it's 6% employee matched by the employer, which is 6%, and a 2% top up. So you can see on the left-hand side there, Jack's contributions, what would have cost him is just over 84,000. Employers would have matched that, so just over 84,000 as well, and a state top-up of just over 28,000. So Jack's total savings is 196,287. Now, if you include the projected net investment returns over the 41 years, his total projected fund at retirement is just over 375,000. So that's really there, I suppose. Like that's a fantastic pot to achieve, and that's really going to help bridge the gap for when he isn't working anymore and he's not solely reliant on the state pension. So we look at the investment options. The Auto-Enrolment Authority are to appoint 4 investment providers, and each of these investment providers, there's going to be 3 risk levels. So you've got low risk, medium, and high, and there'll also be a 4th fund, if you want to say, to choose from, which is it's a lifestyle strategy fund, or known as the default fund. So what that does is it automatically will de-risk from higher to lower risk depending on your age and your years left to retirement. So if you're 15 years from retirement, you're going to be automatically put into a higher risk fund, and then it's going to gradually decrease the closer you get to retirement. Now, what they've advised as well is that the returns that these funds are going to get are on a pooled return basis. So what that means is there's 4 investment managers to choose from, but the individual or the employees will get the average of all of the medium risk funds, all of the high risk. So, if you were to choose a medium risk fund, you would get the average of the 4 medium risk returns from these investment managers. So I suppose they're trying to simplify it and make it a level playing field that, everyone who's in high risk is going to get the same return regardless of the investment manager provider that they're put into. Another point as well is that you can only ever choose one of the funds that are available. There's no option for portfolio splits, to do 50% into high risk and 50% into medium. You can only ever choose low, medium, or high. And all of this would be at a low cost of an annual management charge of 0.5%. So a couple of key features. The pot follows member approach is really to simplify things, that if an employee was to finish up at one job and transition over to a new company, that their pot will follow them. So if they were to finish in April and start the new job in May, that the contributions that are deducted from the salary would just continue on as normal, and the payments would be sent across to the AE authority, and there's no break or gap in the contributions. There's options to opt out, and there is option to suspend the contributions as well. So it's been set up on a quasi-mandatory basis. So what that means is everyone is, within the threshold, you're going to be automatically enrolled, but there is an option to opt out. So there's 2 options where employees can opt out. After 6 months of enrollment into the auto-enrollment scheme, or after a contribution rate change. So from the couple of slides back, you saw every 3 years there was a contribution rate change. So employees can opt out 6 months after a rate change. Now, it's important to note that there is only 2 months that they're eligible to opt out within months 7 and 8 that they have to opt out. If they don't, they'll be automatically continued to be in or to make contributions into the scheme. So if they opt out, they will be refunded their own contributions since enrollment, but all of the employer and state contributions to date will remain in the pot under their name. Our employees can suspend their participation at any other time. So what happens with that is then the contributions will remain in their pension pot along with the employer and the state contributions. And then after 2 years, they're going to be automatically re-enrolled. So inertia is a feature of the pension landscape. So they're really hoping that kind of after the 6 months are up, that a lot of employees and individuals will more than likely be used to their new to contributing into a pension scheme, and will just continue on with contributions. Let's go on to the next slide, please, Anna. Yeah, so a couple of points to note. There will be a pay reference period, which will determine if an employee will likely reach the earning thresholds in a year. So it's going to look back on a 13-week period to assess eligibility. That if an employee has earned over 5,000, they will be automatically enrolled into this auto-enrollment scheme. So the eligible employees, they're going to be identified through revenue data, which is why that it's really, really important that all of the contributions are being deducted through payroll. So they have advised that there's going to be no minimum standard at the outset. So once that they can see that there's an employee and employer contribution applied through payroll, so noted on the employee's pay slip, there's going to be no minimum standard. So within the first 7 years, they're going to start enforcing these minimum standards. So if you look at year 7, it's going to be 4.5% employee matched by 4.5% employer. So that's really when they're going to make sure that the contributions that are being put into the pension are matching exactly as it should be. So I suppose another important thing here is that company directors who pay PRSI as an employee but don't have contributions going through payroll, if they're in that threshold of earning more than 20,000 and age between 23 and 60, they will be enrolled into the auto-enrollment scheme. And the employer contributions, they will be tax deductible as a company expense. So you'll be able to offset that, and they'll be applicable for corporation tax relief at about 12.5%. Just go on to the next slide, please, Anna. No, I think there's maybe one more back, I think maybe. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. So I suppose planning for employees, the planning and budgeting really, the process should start now. Being proactive is going to save you a lot of time and stress. Firstly, you probably want to identify all employees who are in the criteria for this auto-enrollment scheme. Consider approaches for meeting the AE obligations that will best suit your organization. Potential impacts on existing company pension schemes, if relevant. That there might be probationary periods before you can join a company pension. It may be set up on a voluntary basis. So these are all things that you will need to review if you have a current company pension scheme already in place, that is. Review a contract of employment for existing and new hires. And probably one of the most important one is formulate your strategy for effective communication to employees of the decision that you've gone with. And lastly, look, don't panic. There's still plenty of time there, but it really, really is important to seek financial advice and guidance on all options available. There's no one size fits all. One company may opt for auto-enrollment, but another company may decide that depending on their workforce, the traditional pensions that are available is more suitable. So look, just don't panic. There's plenty of time. And that is all of my slides. So I will pass you over to Brendan.
Thanks, Ben. Good afternoon, everybody. I thought it would be useful in kind of building on Ben's kind of overview of some of the mechanics of what's envisaged in terms of auto-enrollment to kind of gradually get into a conversation, I suppose, about some of the implications and things that we kind of all need to think about as the implementation challenge of this kind of looms. I strongly suspect it will be some time as well, maybe before we see the final shape of this, because there's still a lot of moving parts, and I'll touch on a few of those maybe over the next few minutes. As Ben mentioned at the outset, this whole notion of auto-enrollment has been around for a long time. And the fact that it's been around for a long time and has taken such a period of time to get to even this point, where now we have a proposed legislative framework for it, speaks, I think, to that complexity that's associated with the design of the scheme and figuring out how all of that would operate. I think, Ben has touched on a few of these points in his remarks, but a few things maybe just to highlight from my point of view. One of the big issues, obviously, is that in terms of the eligibility piece, if people aren't in the earnings range, for example, more than 20,000, etc., not in the age cohort, and if they aren't already in a scheme, and obviously, if not auto-enrollment, they might still have the option, obviously, or they may choose to opt in. One of the big issues I foresee is that, like, if you get people into this kind of auto-enrollment scheme, and Ben touched on this, is, contributions are going to be fixed and there's no flexibility to pay contributions above. So which I personally think is a big pity, because if you've managed to get people into the mindset of paying something towards their retirement, and if they are still willing to make contributions, then, ideally the scheme should be capable of facilitating that, but that's not intended at the moment. Now, maybe that might change in time, and other solutions may have to be found to that. But I just think that's a pity of itself. And I think it's also really important to understand that if there's an existing scheme, an employer sponsored scheme, the business isn't going to be able to kind of auto-enroll people who, haven't auto-enroll people into the company scheme if they haven't already joined by the time all of this takes effect. So therefore, the default is that auto-enrollment will apply. So therefore, in that organization, you'll end up with two schemes effectively. You're going to have the employer-sponsored scheme, and obviously then a cadre of people who are covered by auto-enrollment. I think the issues arising too from this issue of what's tax deductible and what isn't might not at face value seem to be a big issue, but I actually think it'll become a big issue in time. And what I mean by that is employer contributions are going to be deductible for, as Ben mentioned, CPT at or about the 12.5%. But obviously employee contributions aren't. So therefore, that's a real hit to people, potentially to the bottom line, in terms of their week-to-week salary or month-to-month paycheck, as the case may be, out of which they will have no choice but to pay that, unless, of course, they opt out. And as I'll touch on maybe a little bit later, I personally think that's going to raise issues about the fairness about tax offsets, and may also feed into a difficult conversation about pay and reward issues more generally. And a really important issue, I actually think, is that obviously, notwithstanding, and Ben has shown a good example earlier about the combined effect of the various contribution rates between the employee, employer, and obviously from the state. And there's another example on screen about somebody say at or about 20,000, and there's no doubt, look, from a standing start, of course that looks attractive, right? But remember, by comparison with a lot of employer-sponsored schemes, and typically today, let's assume we're talking about a DC scheme where you have average contribution rates of 5%, maybe from the employee, 7% from the employer, but you also have flexibility to pay added contributions. So if by some stretch, if you have an employer-sponsored scheme, it is likely to be more attractive, likely to have much greater flexibility, and all that kind of goes with that. And Ben touched on the importance of communication, and I would agree. One big issue I think that will loom here for companies who already have a scheme is what they plan to do or not, as the case may be, to encourage greater participation, perhaps, in the employer scheme. As with all things regulatory, and this is no exception as far as labour market is concerned, if there's a failure, obviously, to meet the obligations, then the employer is subject to penalty and possibly prosecution. So there is a pain barrier, I'm afraid, associated with this. So in terms then, just to move on, in terms of just some of the options which I thought would be worth mentioning, I suppose in headline terms, look, you can simply do nothing, wait until all of this happens, and eventually you get I think what's going to be called a payroll notification from the Auto-Enrolment Authority, and you simply pick up the pieces at that point and put arrangements in place. If you already have an employer-sponsored scheme, then effectively you're going to have to run with a dual scheme approach. And as I say, that in time is going to raise issues, because obviously, for the most part, the employer scheme is going to be a better option compared to the auto-enrollment scheme. And one interesting option, which increasingly companies are doing a lot of homework on, is looking to see how they can use the existing pension arrangements they have in place or a PRSA to address auto-enrollment compliance. And as you know, in terms of PRSA, while there's an obligation as a de minimis to provide people with the option or with the opportunity to access a PRSA, there isn't the obligation on the employer to pay into it. But nonetheless, as we understand it, in terms of the way auto-enrollment is intended to work, it gives rise to the potential for either the employer-sponsored scheme or PRSA to be designed so that all employees are effectively deemed to be what's called under the legislation potentially in exempt employment, and therefore outside of the scope of auto-enrollment, and effectively that everybody's in a single scheme. Now, look, there's a job of work in that. There's a complexity to it. A lot of kind of tailoring, obviously, to company circumstances and staff profiles and all of that. But our sense is that that's an area that a lot of organizations will be looking at ahead of this coming in. Maybe some of the basics to touch on, which just to kind of point out some of the obvious kinds of issues, which is, look, figuring out who's actually in scope, and do we know in our organization how many people are in or not in a pension scheme, who are signed up to a PRSA or not, and all of that. So, you know, we need to do the numbers. This issue too of costs, I think, is important, and Ben touched on this, obviously, around, you know, the contributions are going to be based on gross pay, and very often a lot of maybe a typical employer sponsor scheme might be based on say basic pay. So you're going to have different cost outcomes depending on whether you're looking to pursue a single scheme solution or you're happy to operate a dual scheme approach. And of course, there are going to be administrative costs with this as well. And I think we mentioned too earlier, obviously all of this is going to be administered through payroll. So there's a big assumption here that payroll providers are going to be up to speed with all of this. So depending on who your payroll provider is, a domestic provider might be totally all over this, and planning to have great familiarity and systems change to be able to facilitate this. If your payroll provider perhaps is maybe offshore somewhere, you know, how up to speed are they with this? Are they in a position to make the necessary adjustments to provide the necessary level of service support? They're all obviously questions to ask. And I should also mention there are obviously significant kind of employment law implications as well, because obviously the whole issue, for example, too, of what changes you may need to make in terms of contractual change for somebody who's joining the organization, or indeed for existing employees, and, you know, does the things like, for example, eligibility criteria for entry into the existing employer scheme have to be looked at. So there's a variety of issues there that absolutely need to be thought about. The communications agenda, I think that Ben, as I touched on this, but one issue apart from making people aware that this is coming. I think there's obviously a balancing act here because, look, I think from a policy point of view, inherently, this is a good thing. There's 800,000 people, who haven't made any provision for their retirement. So from a public policy point of view, and I think from the point of view of the labour market and employment generally, this is absolutely a good thing. But there are significant challenges, and amongst those, for example, is communicating and how you communicate and what message you communicate to people about the implications of this. And part of that, I think, is going to have to be important decisions that you might make about to what extent do you want to encourage people to sign up to, let's say, an in-house employer sponsor scheme in advance of auto-enrolment, or what your attitude is going to be to that. So I think that's a really important issue to be got right. Another area I think that has been seriously underestimated in all of this, notwithstanding the focus on the regulatory change, is the impact on staff relations, because logic, and I know logic and staff relations sometimes are uneasy bedfellows, but the reality is that if in an organization you end up with a dual scheme, you have an employer sponsored scheme and you also have an auto-enrolment, and you have two groups of staff who are paying different contribution rates, they're accessing different level of benefits. Notwithstanding, everybody might understand why that happened from a standing start once auto-enrolment comes in. But we all know in the real world that over time, that has the potential, at least in my view, to lead to some staff relations issues, where you have one group being aggrieved because they don't have access maybe to the higher benefits under the employer sponsor scheme, even though maybe they could have done that historically, but for whatever reason didn't. And in time, that just becomes a source of contention of itself, but it can also obviously feed to other issues or whatever. And I just think that's an area that hasn't received too much attention and is worth thinking about. I have deliberately mentioned the wider issue of pay and reward here, because we also have to mention that this is happening at a time when obviously people have just come through and are still navigating the tail end of the so-called cost of living crisis. We've seen pay escalation in the market, not least because obviously of combination of either inflationary effects, but also the tightness of the labor market down to 4% odd, essentially full employment. And, we're seeing pay movements, stay at a high enough level. And so if on top of this, you have a situation where employees who are not an employer in an employer sponsored scheme, starting out at contribution rates of 1.5% and eventually, where contribution rates end up at 6%, and in particular where the employee contribution is not offsettable in tax terms against PRSI, USC, etc., as Ben mentioned previously. I think, and especially amongst, let's call it maybe those sectors that are so-called lower paying in the economy, I think that's going to give rise to significant issues for staff in terms of affordability issues, and may well therefore feed through into higher pay expectations more generally. In other words, people will say, well, look, you know, I didn't go looking for this. It may well be a good thing. I understand that, but I can't afford to do it now. So, Mr. Employer, you're going to have to help me. And that means increasing my pay if I'm going to have to make this contribution. So I do think that is a potential significant issue waiting in the long grass as a potential consequence of all of this. And then just, I suppose, to move finally to some significant issues that are in the current debate that people need to be aware of. And these are, I put these in the bucket of unresolved issues. And I mentioned the issue of the PRSA, for example, which essentially, you know, as a de minimis, people have to have access to, even if the employer isn't paying into it. And it's notable that already in the debate that the Irish Congress of Trade Unions has raised a flag of concern that where people with a PRSA would not be automatically enrolled and therefore wouldn't have access to the minimum employer contribution for at least 7 years after auto-enrolment would commence. So, you know, again, the unknown here is whether that so-called loophole, as Congress have described it, whether anything will be further said or done about that before the legislation is finally passed. But I think that's an important issue to keep an eye on. There is also some concern, I think, across, I suppose, the industry more generally, to say that, look, there is at least the risk that auto-enrolment could do harm to existing occupational schemes. And that over time that you will see a dumbing down potentially of contribution rates maybe into employer-sponsored schemes. I personally think that's unlikely, but nonetheless, look, there are views out there that suggest that that could happen. And again, there's this issue that obviously if somebody has signed up to a PRSA without an employer contribution, that they're losing out on potential employer contributions that they would have got through auto-enrolment if they hadn't joined a PRSA. I think there's also a lot of work still being done around the establishment of the auto-enrolment, the administrative oversight body, so to speak, the regulatory body, or NERSA, I think is to use that acronym. But in particular, what's the information sharing requirements that's going to be put on the employer with that authority? So that'll raise all sorts of issues about data protection, GDPR, et cetera, and all of that presumably will be prescribed by regulation. And then one which is a little bit quirky in particular is that there may well be obviously those who maybe are in a fortunate position where they have saved for their retirement and are at levels that are close to the standard fund threshold of just over 2 million. But remember this, that under the auto-enrolment scheme, as is currently envisaged, if somebody is in the category, the age category, obviously earning over 20,000, etc., and subject to the max, and even if they are not making active contributions to a scheme, then auto-enrolment will apply to them once they're an employee. So by accident, those people, even though they're close to perhaps, you know, the standard fund threshold, could find themselves exceeding the standard fund threshold. And as for those of you who are familiar with the detail, you know, anything above, there's a tax of 68.8% on crystallization. Now, yes, people have the option to opt out, but there's a narrow window in which, as Ben has described, people can do that. But again, it's a that's in one of those regulatory quirks, I think, that a lot of people maybe haven't tuned into. So I suppose the key message is this is inherently a good thing. It will happen. The assumption is that the legislation will be passed under this government and be given effect. And if it doesn't, which means that if it isn't done by, I think the election has to happen by March of next year, then the legislation will actually fall and we're back to square one. I think that's unlikely to happen. It will happen, in my view, as Ben has intimated, it'll be a 2025 commencement date. And the smart thing is to start doing your homework now, albeit that there's still a lot of detail yet to be figured out. So perhaps I might hand back to Siobhan, and thank you for listening.
Thanks a million, Ben, and thanks a million, Brendan. There's an awful lot of detail, and I think I get the sense that the devil is in the detail with this one. We've a couple of questions in. What about the temporary agency worker who's paid hourly? And what about the temporary agency worker that might do a week with me and then 3 weeks off again? Basically somebody without continuous levels of employment who is hovering between different agency assignments with different agencies. The information refers to part-time staff, but it doesn't specifically mention temporary agency workers. And then another one I'm going to give you as well, so that we can get through two at the same time. Could we clarify the auto-enrolment will apply to a candidate who's working as a temp through the agency? However, the booking would be ad hoc on a week-to-week basis. So some really good questions so far. I'll go to you first, Brendan.
Thanks, Siobhan. Oh, great questions, guys. Well, sorry, first principles, maybe to set some of those out, and then I have no doubt there are details that still have to be worked out. But under the legislation, right, I mean, the employer is going to be the person paying the emoluments, is what is termed actually in the legislation. So my expectation is here, look, the agency is going to have arrangements in place, and the payroll operation that you have will have to take that into account, albeit once the person meets the relevant threshold, the 20,000, the age profile, all of that. So obviously that's going to have to be segmented to reflect the hours pattern, all of that sort of stuff. But the way this is set up or is being spoken of, outside of that broad eligibility criteria that Ben articulated much better than I at the beginning, it's a blunt instrument. Unless you're already in a scheme, an employer-sponsored scheme, once you meet those eligibility criteria, age and salary basis, then you're covered. There has been no exception made, for example, at the moment that I have seen of de minimis hours, less than X hours a week or a month or anything like that. Once you meet the age and earnings criteria, then you're covered.
Super. I have a really good one for you, Ben. There's a bit of tax planning going on somewhere in agency land, I can tell you that. So just to confirm, if an employee has a PRSA but isn't making employee contributions, and the employer is making contributions, in brackets, we've seen a rise in this practice since BIK limits were removed in 2023, will these employees be exempt because they are enrolled in the scheme, albeit an employer contribution only? And also clarify for those who don't understand that their employer can make a contribution directly into their pension on their behalf. Please, Ben.
Yeah, great question. So I suppose the answer to your question is, sorry, just rephrase that again there, Siobhan, sorry. What was the
BIK rules were removed in 2023. So this candidate or individual has a
do they? Yeah, sorry.
They're not making contributions themselves, but the employer is making contributions on their behalf. Do they still qualify for the scheme? For the employer to have to continue making
yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, I have. Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, so once there is contributions being made through payroll, noted on a payslip, until the minimum standards are enforced, this is from what we've gathered from reading the legislation. Once they can see that there is contributions going through payroll, whether it's employer or employee, that would suffice for them to not be enrolled in the auto-enrollment scheme. It's when the minimum standards come in, that's when they're going to check to make sure that they're matching the contribution levels both for employee and employer. So the answer to the question is, if it is just an employer sponsored scheme and it's deducted through salary from the outset, that would suffice them being exempt from the auto-enrolment.
Okay, super. And one of the points that you made, Ben, was that it follows you from job to job. One of the questions we have in is, how would employers know how much people who are agency workers have earned to date? I mean, year to date, if they were only starting with us today.
Yeah, I suppose it would really be kind of whatever their salary, I suppose, or their pay that they're hired on, and kind of, I know it might be difficult to work out exactly how much work they're going to be doing, or whether they're going to be in that threshold of over the 20,000. But that's where that pay reference period is really going to come into effect. So it's done on a 13-week basis, that if they see that employee has earned over 5,000 within a 13-week rolling period, they will then be sent a notification to start the pension contributions to auto-enrolment.
That's a really good question. To clarify, so you're taking somebody on and they're only working for you for 3 or 4 days. When do you know how that you're meant to auto-enroll them? Who are you meant to decide yourselves that, okay, I've a compliant temp going out on a 3-day assignment? What is it, the first time that you do payroll that you again, are we notifying revenue, or revenue notifying us, or the pension authority notifying who?
Yeah, again, there's still
agency work is at the moment, it's very fluid.
Yeah, it's at the moment, I mean, from what we've been told, it's like once that they start, and if you can figure out exactly what the kind of their salary could be, if they're going to be over that 20,000 threshold, then they're going to be automatically enrolled. And it's only really, I suppose, where, look, if when it is set up at the start, look, there's going to be a few issues with it. Maybe some employees I said missed, but that's where this AE authority are going to come into effect, and they will then notify the employer that this employee has gone over the threshold within the 13-week rolling period, and they need to start making contributions.
No, that's super. Thanks, Ben. Final one for you, Brendan. What are the repercussions for non-participation by an employer? Are they financial? Are they legislative? What are the repercussions for non-compliance?
At the moment, it'll be a financial penalty, is likely to be the main sort of focus, and that, obviously that'll be escalatory, but somebody could also could end up being deemed to have committed a criminal offence, and in our experience, by the way, here as well, is that with the evolution of employment rights compliance, the focus is likely to be on the directors of the company.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, it's been hugely informative, I have to say, to Ben and to Brendan. Now, as both of our speakers said at the beginning, this is a movable feast. We could have an election anytime between November and March. Will it be a priority? Will it not be a priority? As it comes closer, we would encourage you to get in contact with, the likes of Ben in Chapter Financial, or any qualified financial advisor or pensions advisory company. But we will be holding further briefings as more knowledge comes out as to terms of what the implementation is going to be like. But I would urge anybody on this call to check with their payroll provider today, or as soon as closest to today. Some of the providers from outside of the state, as Brendan said, are not going to support auto-enrolment, and transitioning on a payroll system is a complicated matter. So we'd urge you to give that your strongest attention as soon as you possibly can. Other than that, we'd just like to say thank you to all of you in the ERF membership for your participation, and we will continue to bring topics of interest to you that you request. So please, if there's anything you'd like, any other topic you'd like us to discuss, or you'd like another session on this, just let the ERF head office know, and we'll be happy to support that. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Thanks, guys.